How many of you can think of at least one time in your marriage, those that are married, where you went through an incredible storm? How many of you have been through an incredible storm in your marriage? Why are all the married people putting up their hands? Because they've all been in it. Let me ask one more question. How many of you have already been through a marital storm this morning? You've already had one? A whole bunch of hands go up.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
You know, this is what the scripture tells us about marriage. It's Proverbs 18:22, and it says, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing." And one of the things I always tell young people, and it's a bit smart alecky, but I tell them anyway, I say, don't just find a thing, find a good thing. And you know, if we're going to find a spouse, we need to find a good spouse. And the reason is there's so many marriages that struggle. And every person deserves a good spouse. And you do see people marrying spouses that you would consider questionable. No one deserves an abusive or an alcoholic or a negative or a critical spouse. We all deserve a good spouse. And so he who finds a good wife finds a good thing. The philosopher Plato put it this way. He said, by all means, get married. And if you find a good wife, you will be happy. But if you find a bad wife, well, then you can just become a philosopher. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 7. This is a story you probably all know. You probably know the interpretation of it. But we're going to look at it in the light of marriage and family. And this is what it says. Verse 24, Matthew chapter 7. It says, therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I liken to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Now everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now, most of us know that Jesus is talking specifically about building your spiritual house. He's talking about building your life upon not only hearing the words of God, but actually doing them and applying them to your life. And that would be the correct interpretation. But I'm going to take it on an application towards building your family house, building your household, building your home. But if you're going to build your house, your family, your marriage needs to be built upon the solid rock foundation of Christ's words, and not only hearing them, but doing them. People say to me, you know, marriage is hard, which it is. And they say, how come it doesn't come with an owner's manual? Well, it does. It's called the Bible. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of verses on marriage, on family, on children. And here's what I want to tell you. There is no problem, no situation that you will encounter in your family or your marriage or your relationships that you cannot find an answer in the Word of God. And so when we come up with this excuse that there's no owner's manual, it's just absolutely incorrect. And I want you to notice something about this passage. He talks about those who hear the word and do it, they're building on the rock. Those who hear the word and do not do it, they're building on the sand. And then he says this about those two houses. He said, doesn't say if the rains come, and if the storms come, and if the winds come. It says when, right? I mean, it says, and they came. And if you're married, I'm going to make a guarantee for you today. You will have storms in your marriage. In fact, let me ask you this question. How many of you can think of at least one time in your marriage, those that are married, where you went through an incredible storm? How many of you have been through an incredible storm in your marriage? Why are all the married people putting up their hands? Because they've all been in it. Let me ask one more question. How many of you have already been through a marital storm this morning? You've already had one. A whole bunch of hands go up. There's always a few, right? And that's just the fact that we will go through the storms of life. And he tells us this, that if we build our house upon the rock, we will endure those storms. I'm going to give you an illustration today, and I think you're going to enjoy it, actually. And so we're going to throw up a picture. This is a picture called the Dome House of Cape Romano. And the Dome House of Cape Romano was built in the 1980s. This couple, they traveled to south of Florida, and there's an island there, uninhabited island called Kais Island. It's off the southwestern tip of Florida in the Gulf of Mexico. And they bought a piece of property, and they decided they were going to build this house on the beach. And this, let me tell you about this house. He knew he was on a cape. Anytime you, in marine world, a cape is where the current is, it's where the storms were, and he knew that. And so at great expense, he barged all this equipment out there, and he built this fabulous house. And what he did was he put piles deep into the sand so it wouldn't move. He built it high like he did above, so just in case there is a storm and the waters come up, you know, they'll just wash underneath and it'll be fine. He built the domes out of concrete, knowing that he was in a hurricane zone, and what was going to happen is the hurricane winds were going to come. They were just going to blow over those domes, and that house was going to stand. That was his plan. And so this is what it looked like after a year. They moved into the home. It was beautiful. It was landscaped. It was on the beach. It was a stunning, beautiful home. And they were going to retire in this beautiful place and live in this little paradise. The next picture shows you the inside of the house. It was as pretty on the inside as it was on the outside. It was beautifully furnished. And it had a beautiful view of the Gulf of Mexico. Here's an aerial photo of it. And you can see the domes there in the sort of in the middle there, and they're on this beautiful spit of beach. And so you've got trees on one side and the ocean on the other side, and beautiful beach. What could possibly go wrong, right? I want to show you the picture of this house after only one storm. It looked like this, and there it was. Now the good news is the house is still standing. But unfortunately, the beach moved. And sometimes that's what happens when things, and so, you know, I'd read about this story. I was always fascinated by the Cape Romano Dome House. And I thought to myself, I could tell this story to the congregation and that would be fine. Or I could go and personally investigate it myself so I could verify this story. And so at great personal expense and time and trouble, I rented this boat, filled it with gas, and let me tell you something, there was no personal enjoyment in this whatsoever. I've done this 100% entirely for you. And Kathy and I, we got into this boat, and we navigated the coastal waters of Florida for 30 miles to Kais Island, to Cape Romano, and we wanted to see if everything we'd heard about the Dome House was true. And this is what it looked like. That is the Dome House today. You can see how excited I am because we found our way there. Getting home was going to be another thing. And there was the Dome House, and you can see it's, I guess you could argue it's still standing. One could make that argument, and it is still a home to seagulls, but it is completely, totally, utterly destroyed, and that happened within about 3 or 4 years. And just so you can get another aerial view, you're going to love this. This is what it looks like. It's way out. The beach, look, the beach is gone. The sand is gone and has moved somewhere else. Somebody else has a beach. And it has moved, and there it is sitting in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. And this is what happens to your marriage when you build your marriage on the sand. It can be all pretty on the outside, all the Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie on the outside. But if it's not built upon the rock, then that house will fall, and that fall will be great. Oh, I'm glad you like that. That cost me a lot of money, that illustration, so I'm glad you appreciated it. This next illustration didn't cost me anything. I got it on the internet. Just to give you a contrast, this is called the Clingstone House. It's in the Atlantic Ocean. It's over 100 years old. Sitting in a hurricane zone off the coast of Rhode Island. It has been standing strong and true for 110 years, and it's going to continue to standing. Why? Because it's built upon the rock. So you all have the visual. You all know how your marriage is to be built. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to show you what this foundation would look like. Building a rock-solid marriage. Here's my example. And you can look there, I've got 5 rocks, 5 stones in this foundation. You could build more because goodness knows there's more C words than this. And so you could build more of this foundation. But here's what they are. Christ, communication, consideration, confession, and commitment. We're going to start first with Christ. There is no more important building stone in your life than building your marriage on Christ the rock, right? He says, the scripture says, that he is the chief cornerstone. That's the one that everything rests upon. How many of you remember that Lutheran hymn? On Christ, my solid rock I stand. Finish it for me. All other ground is shifting sand. And see, what happens in our world is the values of our world are nothing more than shifting sands. And when you build your marriage on that, it will not stand. And what will stand is when we build our life upon the rock. And it's so many challenges with marriage today. And the one thing that is absolutely necessary to help us ensure that we have a successful marriage is this thing of building it on the rock. One of the things I tell couples during their wedding ceremony is, it's going to sound like terrible advice, but I say to them, whatever you do, don't live your life for one another. They go, huh? I thought that was the whole point. I say, no, that's not good enough. That actually won't sustain your marriage. I say, this is what you need to do. You need to live your life for Christ. And if you will live your life for Christ, then you will live your life for one another, and then you will have a successful marriage. A number of years ago, Kathy and I were called to a situation where some friends of ours were in sort of serious marital trouble. And not only was their marriage in trouble, their faith was in trouble. They hadn't been in church for months, and they weren't reading their Bible, and they weren't praying together. And so they were in trouble with their faith and their marriage. And we sat there and we talked to them for some period of time. And I was challenging them that they were not going to beat this storm in their life and in their marriage if they didn't put Christ back in the center. And then sort of out of the blue, Kathy contributed this, and these were the words that came out of her mouth. She said, it's true. If Mark and I hadn't been Christians, I would have left him a long time ago. and so I didn't say anything when it came out of her mouth, but when we were driving home, I said, seriously, Kathy, did you feel like you needed to be quite that self-disclosing? And she says, well, you're not the easiest guy in the world to live with. And so anyway, we hashed that through, and we're in marriage counseling now. And my point of all of this is to say that as Christians in particular, we're going to have a very hard time if we can't get Christ right in the center of our marriage. And it's the key. It's the solid rock in which we stand. All other ground is shifting sand. And that's why I say when you find a spouse, find a good spouse. He who finds a good wife finds a good thing. We're looking for good things in our life. There's this story about these four little old biddies, and they're sitting around in the old folks' home, and they're playing bridge. And one of them says to the group, who's that good-looking new guy over there? And one of them says, oh, that's Stan. He just got out of Stony Mountain Penitentiary. He served 10 years for killing his wife. And the other one said, ooh, so then he's single. So the first foundation stone to a successful marriage is, of course, Christ. The second one is communication. You know that a marriage can endure a lot of things, but lack of communication is not one of them. We were created to communicate. We were created as relational beings that require that intimacy with another human being. And once that begins to drift out of a marriage, that marriage begins to fall into a lot of trouble. Now, here's my observation. You take it or leave it. But my observation is I look at young couples, and they're actually generally pretty good at the communication piece. They're talking about their dreams and their future and their aspirations, and there's a lot of talk and a lot of communication, and that's why they're in love, and that's why they're getting married. But I have seen so many couples that as time goes by, that communication level drops and drops and drops, sometimes to the point where it becomes completely insignificant, where they're living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, and they barely even talk. And you understand it because we get busy in life, right? And the husband's out making a living and building a career, and the wife's raising kids and running them around all over town. And then one day they're sitting at the breakfast table, and they look at each other, and they don't say it, but they think in their head, who is that? And they have completely lost contact with one another. So when I talk about communication, this is not an option for a marriage. And as your marriage goes along, sometimes you have to work even harder at it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the 5 levels of communication within marriage. And here they are, throwing them up. They're small talk, serious talk, self-talk, soul talk, and sweet talk. And I just want you to know I'm talking specifically about marriage. These levels of communication are not the same for other relationships. And so I want to talk about these 5 levels, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. But the first level is small talk. And people say that small talk is insignificant, and they're absolutely incorrect about that. Because I'll tell you what, it's the primer for all conversation. All conversation, all relationship begins with small talk. It is that which primes the pump. It's that which builds the rapport. And if you can't even have small talk, then there's no way you're going to go any deeper than that. And you know, I said guys sometimes are knuckleheads about this. See, here's how a woman thinks. Mostly, not always. But, you know, she'll go, my marriage is in trouble. We need to talk. The guy will go, my marriage is in trouble. I better keep my mouth shut. And it's just such a different approach to this. And so what we need to do is begin just simply with small talk. But then it goes to another level. And the second level is serious talk. And serious talk is when you talk about the serious matters in your family, family life and priorities and obligations and finances and your kids. And that's serious talk. And that's the next level after small talk, which most people can still get to. And then there's this thing called self-talk. And self-talk is when we begin to open up about what's going on within us, when we begin to reveal what's going on the inside. I can't tell you how many times I've had women come up to me and they say this, I just want to know what he's thinking. I say, I can help you up with that. Nothing. What makes you think he's thinking anything? He's watching television. He's not thinking, especially not about you. And it's sad. But here's the thing. You have to begin to communicate on that self-talk level where we're beginning to open up our heart. So first small talk, then serious talk, then self-talk, and then we get to soul talk. And soul talk is so important because what that is that's when we begin to talk at a much deeper level. And we're talking about our fears and our insecurities and our dreams and our goals for life. And we're beginning to reveal what's really going on in the deep recesses of our heart and our spiritual journey and the things we're struggling with. And let me tell you something. Soul talk is not a level that is for everybody out there. You don't go into Safeway shopping into the vegetable department and try to get people and engage them into soul talk. That is not a smart thing to do. And it is probably something that is reserved for your spouse and a few very close friends, where there is a place where you can reveal the inner machinations of what's going on in your heart. And then the final step of this, and I think this is really reserved for marriage, is sweet talk. And sweet talk is where we get to that level where we are able to communicate our emotions and our love and our affection. And that doesn't happen with a lot of people in this world. But here's what the unfortunate thing is. There are so many marriages that have been going for so long and have long since forgotten the three most important words, which are, I love you. And it's amazing how hard it is to get those three words out of our mouth when you've been married too long. How many of you remember Star Wars when Princess Leia finally confesses and she says to Han Solo, she says, I love you. And he says, yeah, I know. That's the wrong answer. And so here's what I want to challenge you to do. Every couple, I want to challenge you that sometime today or tonight, you would ask one another this question. Where are we on this continuum? How are we doing with our communication? And ask yourself that question honestly and make a commitment to try to take it to a new level and to a deeper level. So first of all, we have Christ as our foundation, and then we have, of course, communication. And the third one is consideration. And what I mean by consideration is putting the other person ahead of yourself. I've mentioned the University of Washington, the chief researcher there, and he's probably the most foremost expert on marriage on the planet, perhaps, and his name is Dr. John Gottman. And he says that he has been at this so long that he can walk into your home and within 30 seconds, he can determine whether your marriage is going to succeed or fail. Do you know where he goes? He goes into the bathroom and gets what he looks for. Whether the toilet seat is up or down. And he says if that toilet seat is up, that marriage is in trouble already. Now, I am not going to ask you, I'd love to, but I'm not going to ask you how many of you left the house this morning with the toilet seat up. I'm not going to ask you that question. And some of you might want to spend $500 to get those ones that close and open automatically. It could save your marriage for $500. Now, I thought, you know what, in the interest of full disclosure, it's only fair for me to show you my toilet seat. And so here it is, and you can see the toilet seat is down. See, honey, I left the toilet seat down just for you. That's a joke. It's not true. It doesn't really look like that. I have other gags that I do, though. So Paul comes along again. Paul has a lot to say about marriage for a single guy, have you noticed? And in Ephesians chapter 5, this is what he tells. He gives some advice to men. And he says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Remember, the church is the bride of Christ, so there's an important parallel here. And he says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He laid down his life for the church. That's what he did. And the example that Paul is giving is that we need to lay down our lives for our wife. We need to put their needs ahead of ours. And if we will do that, then everything will change. And you see, this is hard for us to do, especially, when the men have read the verse that comes before it. It says, wives, obey your husbands. We go, whoa, that's what it's really talking about. Wives, you need to submit and obey to your husbands. There's only one reason why they would obey or submit to you: when you put their needs ahead of your own and you love them as Christ loved the church and lay down his life for the church. That's how you do it. And I have found wives, and they've said, I would gladly submit to him if he would just follow Christ and begin to honor me and put my needs ahead of his. I'll follow him in a minute. And so this is not super complicated stuff. Dr. Phil has this to say about it. You can always sum up relationships up with the Dr. Phil quote, right? And Dr. Phil says, I'll tell you what women really want. They want the husband to do something around the house without being asked. Well, that's like the dumbest advice I've ever heard. What do you guys think? No, I know. I'm just saying, what would happen? What would happen if you came home from work, guys, and you did the dishes and vacuumed the house and cleaned the bathroom? What would happen? Well, she'd probably have a heart attack and die, and then I'd be single, so why would I do that? You know what? She might just survive it. You never know. And you know what, guys? I understand it. I hate laundry and dishes and vacuuming like the rest of you guys. But you know what? If we would just begin to think of what our wife's or husband's needs are and just begin without them asking to go and do it, you'd be amazed what happens. One of the things I do for Kathy, and it's not vacuuming, is one of the things I do is I always wash her car for her. And I know she likes to have her car clean. I know she doesn't like to do it. It's something I can do. And so she's always like, it's a great day when I wash her car because I did something for her without asking her. And not only that, it's good for me because I'm hanging out with a car at least, right? So it's all good. It's sort of a win, win-win. And so I'm just saying, for both of you, husbands and wives, this thing about consideration, putting the other person's needs ahead of your own. The third or fourth one is confession. And what I mean by confession is I mean apologizing. I'm talking about repenting. And there's probably people in this room that are old enough to remember 1970, a movie came out called Love Story. How many remember this movie? A few of you? Remember this story with Ryan O'Neal and Hallie McGraw? And Ryan O'Neal does not look like that anymore. But anyway, there was this story called Love Story, and the tagline, the catchphrase throughout the movie was this: love means never having to say you're sorry. I cannot think of worse advice than that, because confession and apology is the hallmark of Christianity. The scripture is just clear about this. It says, confess your sins one to another. And I just want you to imagine this for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, one of those one another's just might be your spouse. And I know this sounds so simple. We understand apology. We understand repentance. We understand forgiveness when someone apologizes. But you'd be shocked at how little this happens within marriages. One of the persons that we have the hardest time apologizing to is our spouse and our family. I'm going to tell you a story about one of our pastors. I'm not going to tell you his name. I'm hoping you can guess it, though, as I tell the story, so I'll try to give you information. And one of our pastors told me a story just this week. And he took his family, his wife and his children, out to McDonald's. So this is a tip-off, McDonald's, little children, so not me. And so I'm helping you out here as best I can. And so he took them out to McDonald's, bought them all French fries as a treat. And then they got in this argument about whose fries were whose. And he snapped and he yelled at all of them. He yelled at his wife, he yelled at his kids. And their little outing together turned into this funeral. And they all sat in the car, completely silent, not saying a word. And he said he drove home. Everybody was miserable. And he drove home for 5 minutes. It took him to get home. And he said, the whole time I was getting up my courage to apologize to my family for yelling at him. And finally, when we got home, he said, I apologized to my wife and I apologized to my children. And so he was just telling me this story, probably so I could tell you. And I said to him, let me tell you something, Pastor so-and-so, and I'm hoping you're trying to guess. I said, let me tell you something. That did not show weakness. That, as a man, showed strength. When you have the courage to apologize not only to your wife, but to your children, that is tremendous courage. And let me tell you something. What better example could you have than your kids to see you apologize to them when you're wrong, right? So this is a tremendous example. So here we go. We got Christ, we got communication, we got consideration, we got confession, and the last and final thing is commitment. Commitment sort of seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? I mean, everybody understands marriage is supposed to have commitment. Really? Do they? Is that what's happening in our world? When you look at the example that we have in our culture, it is no longer an example of commitment. In 1900, there was only 1 in 100 marriages that ended in divorce. A century later, it was 1 in 2. Something has happened in our culture where we no longer embrace the ideal of commitment in a marriage. And we always think of the marriage ceremony, the vows. So, for better or for worse, for sickness or for health, for richer or for poor, till death do us part. Have you noticed that people don't even use those vows anymore? Why? Because our level of commitment is not the same as it used to be. It has moved to a different level. And we see pop culture, and we see rock stars, and we see movie stars, and we see all these people. And the example we have is that, you know what? Marriages, they may or may not work. You know who the reigning divorce champion in Hollywood is? It's CNN interviewer, or used to be, Larry King. Here's Larry King. Here's pictures of his wives. He's been married 8 times. 8 times. You say I only see 7 women. That's because he married one of them twice. And, this is called Larry's trophy room. It's a little insensitive. Conan O'Brien used to joke when Elizabeth Taylor was around, because she had been married 8 times, exactly the same, to 7 different men, married one twice, Richard Burton. And he said this, Larry King and Elizabeth Taylor are meeting in the finals next month for the All-Star Divorce King or Queen of Hollywood. And of course, she died too soon, so it didn't happen. So here's my point. Here's my point in all of this, is that marriage is a commitment. And Jesus said these words. He said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become flesh. And that which God has joined, let no one put asunder, let no one separate. Did you catch that? Whom God has joined. There is a miracle that happens at the moment of marriage. And don't think it's just some sort of legal contract. It is not. And God is involved with this, and he creates this marriage, and somehow, some way, he takes 2 lives and he fuses them together. It says the two shall become one flesh, and that which God has joined together, let no one put asunder. And I know that there are people here divorced. I know that people have struggled with this. I know that doesn't matter who you are, you're going to have these storms like I was talking about. And one of the words of advice I want to give you, and I always give, is this. You should never, ever talk about divorce in your marriage. In fact, you should ban the word. You shouldn't use the word. Kathy and I made that commitment that we would never use the word, even in jest, divorce. It wasn't something we would ever talk about and entertain in our marriage. It's about building our foundation upon the rock. And the rock is Christ, and the rock is communication, and the rock is consideration, and the rock is confession, and the rock is commitment. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, the two shall become one flesh, and that which God divides, or joins. Let no one put us under. Let's stand together. Nothing like messing up the last word in a sermon. It happens.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.